nice to see you. So many here, so many people here. As the old prison chaplain used to say every Sunday morning, I'll say it again. So it's nice to see you all here. And happy that you decided to stay for this panel discussion on Professor Brooks' presentation, and also this book that we finally have now as a physical existing thing, as far as books can be physically existing things. That's a big philosophical debate, what a book is. Is it well, let's forget that. But in any case, we're here to discuss the themes of Professor Brooks' lecture on the relationship of science and the development of science and secularization as a phenomenon. And we have here, in addition to Professor Brooks, 3 panelists, Tommi Lehtonen, Tapio Luoma, and Lauri Järvilehto, who will each proceed by giving a short beginning statement, like 10-15 minutes, explaining their basic views or basic questions and comments on this issue, and then we'll proceed with discussion first with the panel, among the panelists, and then I'll start taking questions from the audience also. So please hold on to your ideas and questions, and you can present them after the discussion has already taken flight. And also, I implore you, please, questions. So comments are welcome, but we'd like to hear some questions that we could answer and talk about, and hope that people won't take this opportunity to provide a lecture of their own. But without further ado, I give you Tommi Lehtonen.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Tommi Lehtonen. I come from the west coast of Finland, from the University of Vaasa, although I have graduated from this university. Okay, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference or seminar for a very friendly invitation to participate in this discussion and the panel. And also I would like to thank Professor Brooks for a very clear, informative and also stimulating talk. His answer to the question that was already presented in the title of the presentation, and the question was whether science does science lead to secularization? I think that your answer to that question was pretty clear, and it seems to me that your answer was mainly negative, at least in the sense that it seems to me that you was willing to say that we can obviously see that science and secularization have something to do with each other, but it's on the other hand, it's rather clear that science is not the sole reason or even the main reason for secularization. And for the most part, I agree with you, though there may be some differences of nuances, but I come later to them. In my comment speech, my plan is to focus on 3 points, and these points are not they are not criticism on Professor Brooks' view, but I would rather say that they are minor attempts to shed some additional light on certain issues that, in my opinion, are important when we try to make sense of secularization and the possible role of science in it. And the points I will focus on are as follows. I will first of all point out that they are, especially sociologists of religion, they are very much willing to make further distinction in this secularization thesis that you also mentioned, and there are especially 3 important aspects of secularizations that are most often mentioned. by sociologists of religion. And the second point is related to the role of science in modern societies. And perhaps I should add, in the West, namely, there are also cultural differences in terms of secularization and the role of science and so on, which is rather evident. And then the final point is related to the topic that I would like to call or titled as compatibility of religion and science. But I start first with those different aspects or different types of secularization. Namely, many scholars in sociology, and especially in sociology of religion, have distinguished between social differentiation, the decline of religion, and the privatization of religion. So differentiation, decline, and privatization, which all of these three are part of the whole that is called secularization, but they are rather different aspects or different forms of secularization, but they belong together. And now, in the case of each of these three, it may be relevant to question that how is this science related to these different aspects of secularization, namely differentiation, decline of religion, and privatization of religion. And if I would present a very short description or account of these three different forms or aspects of secularization, starting with differentiation. By differentiation in the context of secularization, it's usually meant the fact that when we compare the modern time or modern societies with the societies, for example, medieval times or in the age of the modern Europe, we can quite easily see that religious institutions such as churches, they have not so much political or not so evident political, social or administrative power than they used to have. Whereas the secular institutions, secular administration, governance, and also perhaps some other sectors in society, their political and social influence has and power has increased, or at least it is said that it has increased. This differentiation thesis does not claim that religious institutions such as churches, it does not say that they do not have political or social power at all nowadays, but the claim is that their social and political influence has definitely decreased when compared to some earlier times. I think that the role of science in this social differentiation or the division of social power is rather unclear, and my personal opinion is that science does not have so much to do with this first type of secularization as perhaps with the other two types. And the second type is this decline of religion. That is basically the claim that says that the number of religious people and the extent to which people practice religion, especially in its institutionalized forms or in very external forms like attending masses on Sundays, that the number of people who actively practice religion has declined. And there seems to be rather good empirical sociological evidence for that. For example, in the case of Finland, I think that nowadays the number of Finnish active Finnish participants in masses on regular basis is less than 2% of the whole Finnish population, and the dropping or the decline in terms of active participations seems to be rather clear or obvious. And maybe now the role of science is, as you presented in your talk, it has more relevance in regard to this decline of religion aspect of secularization. Although I definitely agree with you that we cannot say that science and the popularity of scientific worldview could be said to be the sole or even the main reason. But okay, at least there are some persons who can say that scientific research and the results of science have had at least some importance or some effects on that, how what kind of view of religion they have nowadays. Okay, now what comes to this as regards this last aspect of secularization, namely the privatization of religion. I think this is rather interesting from the point of view of science, because judging from the discussions in mass media, it seems that science and scientific research basically has a very good reputation nowadays in many ways. For example, in the way that I would say that many people agree that science is important, and we should support scientific research, also by giving tax funding for universities and other research institutions. And science is considered to be some kind of public property that belongs to basically to everyone, not only to academic people, but it has relevance in public or for the society as a whole. And one of the examples of rather classical examples of this kind of idea of science is the view presented by sociologist Robert Merton, who says that scientific communism or common ownership is one of the most important elements or parts of scientific ethos. And science definitely seems to be understood as a public phenomenon, something that is that belongs to basically to everyone. Whereas, for example, Finland and other North European countries are very good examples of the parts of the world where religion is not anymore regarded as much as a public phenomenon, as something that is private, as a private matter. And partly this privatization of religion, part of secularization, is related to that decline of public or institutional religious practice. Okay. My second point is related to this further to this to the role of science in modern societies. And as I already said, it seems that in the public discussions or the discussions in mass media, it seems to be a rather prevailing attitude and view that science has an important role in modern societies. For example, in terms of sustainable development, in terms of economics, social issues, and also in terms of environment. And so the important social role of science seems to be connected with different kinds of phenomena in society. But now when we come to the relationship between science and religion, there seems to be some kind of imbalance here. Not only from the point of view that I already mentioned, namely that religion is regarded as a private matter and science is something that is public. But also there seems to be that kind of imbalance between the relationship between science and religion, that even if science is considered to be important, religion does not seem to contribute to science or help scientific research at all. Or it seems to be rather difficult to find good and convincing examples where religious ideas or religious doctrines would have substantial positive impact on scientific research. I'm not saying that that no scientist has any religious motivation, perhaps, in her or his work, but this religious motivation is a different thing. When we consider the actual scientific research activities in terms of scientific theories and methods, it seems that religion has perhaps no influence in science. Or, okay, I may be wrong, but I couldn't, to my mind, I couldn't invent or remember any good example, for example, from physics or biology or in chemistry, where religious ideas would have substantially contributed to the scientific studies or scientific research. So it seems to me that, and this is my last point, it seems that this, because of this some kind of imbalanced or one-sidedness of this relationship between science and religion, the discussion about the relationship between science and religion is somehow oriented according to the issue of their compatibility. I mean the question of whether science and religion are compatible or not. But this question is somehow, it's one-sided in the sense that it's motivated by religion. There's no inherent need in science to fit science and religion together. Whereas from the point of view of at least some religious persons, it may be relevant to ask in what way religious doctrines and ideas could be understood to be compatible or interpreted in a way that is compatible and coherent with the results of science. So the motivation or the reason for this kind of compatibility discussion comes from the religious side or from the religious point of view, not from the point of view of science. Now this does not need to be a problem, but I think that this kind of compatibility discussion is a rather weak or rather gloomy starting point for the relationship between science and religion, because it's so one-sided, and definitely it seems that we can have so many different things that are compatible with each other. Actually, religion and science can be compatible because they are so different, they are so distinct, as in your nice example of that bus driver and ballet dancer case. They are so distinct that they are not contradicting each other because they are distinct, different practices, different activities, different views. But then another type to approach this compatibility issue is to consider how religious doctrines and views should be interpreted in order that they would be not logically contradictory with the results of science, but somehow compatible. And of course, whether you think this is an interesting question or not depends, of course, on what kind of view of religion you have. If you think that some kind of evidentialist approach in religious issues is something for you, then this compatibility question is relevant. But if your starting point is non-evidentialist or more like fideist or a kind of Wittgensteinian, then perhaps you are not so much interested to discuss whether results of science and religious doctrines are compatible, because they belong to different language game in that case. Okay, that was all I wanted to say now.
Good afternoon all. My name is Tapio Luoma and I am nowadays the Bishop of the Espoo Diocese, and it is a great pleasure of being here, being invited here, and also I had the joy of listening to the marvelous lecture by Professor Hedley Brooke. I have been working in parish work in the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Finland for 24 years before I entered my present office, and perhaps I just have faced so many questions from the grassroots level of people's everyday life relating somehow to the question of science and theology and their interaction. And so this might be the reason why I now take the stand I now take here, what I'm going to say now. My question is that, well, we have been, this afternoon we have the book about myths has been published. And Professor Brooke told us about the myth of the idea that science has been the main cause for secularization. My question is that why are those myths? I mean, now the 25 myths that are included in the book, why are the myths in the first place important nowadays for so many people? What is the function of the myths? Every myth, whatever it is, always has a function. And my question is, what is the function that those myths have been serving? If we now, or I take for granted, although of course there are many other options or efforts to define the word secularization, but now I concentrate on the definition of secularization, where it is said that secularization in the first place means detachment from faith. Or somehow secularization is a positive stand against a religion, a more or less conscious stand against religious presence in the public sphere and in the society. And what is the reason behind the detachment from faith if we compare the life in present Western society to the life that was there, for example, 200 years ago when Charles Darwin published his book, or when just after the French Revolution, during the time of Enlightenment. So why is it so that people have, the public opinion or the public idea is that there is a large detachment from faith? And I think this might be a myth as well, because when we see around, we can see that the religion is still there, although it doesn't comply to old institutional jackets. But anyway, the religion is there. Why is it so that we think or we feel that there is a detachment from faith? Well, I have been lately reading a book by an American moral psychologist called Jonathan Haidt. and the name of the book is Righteous Mind: Why Good People Fight Over Politics and Religion. And there, this moral psychologist tries to find an answer. What is the relation between emotion and reason when we try in our life when we try to make conclusions and when we try to make up our minds or take a stand towards a thing, or when we try to find an opinion or conviction? The thesis of Jonathan Haidt is that always emotions come first and reason only secondarily. So that reason is needed always to give reasons or to back what emotions tell us. So that our first impression or first way of responding to different things is an emotional response, and we use our reason, our sensibility only for or our cognitive capacity to find reasons for our emotions. So emotions comes first and rationality only second. Well, I wonder what this might mean if this thesis is true. What does it mean when we relate this idea to the discussion we are having now? What might be the reason for secularization in the sense of secularization being detachment from faith? What would it mean if we think that emotions come first and we just use reason to back up what we feel? Well, we heard in the lecture today we heard that there have been several different definitions or ideas why the secularization has took place in the first place. So, if I remember right, Professor Brook said that in a study made in Denmark, it was found out that secularization was due to change in social relations and the diminishment of agricultural society. That might be one reason. Another reason I heard was that it was by Charles Taylor that a kind of self-sufficient humanism is the reason for secularization. Both of them seem to me quite good ideas or descriptions of what a secularization means. And the point by Professor Brook is that neither of these two reasons is related directly to the role of science, so that the science is not the first factor in this process of secularization. But anyway, in this process of secularization, there are also emotions involved. There is indifference. And although people think that indifference is about the same as neutrality, I present the opinion that also indifference is a kind of emotion. It is an emotional stand towards things which I am not interested in. Of course, there is also other degrees of emotions. There might be dislike, and I think that even today we can see that and feel that there are lots of people who see or who feel uncomfortable whenever they meet something related to religions or religion in general. And then, of course, we meet sometimes those most harsh criticism towards church and other religious institutions and religions in general, where there is a clear indication of emotional disgust. And I think that these very existential conditions or existential basis of these kinds of emotions can explain quite well why we are living in a time which we call a secularized time. I have to agree that seen from this point of view, where even a disgust can be raised towards religion or religious thinking, I can see why it is so disgusting, or why there is such a wide dislike towards religion nowadays, and why even science is used to give reasons to this emotion. And one reason might be that, and I have to agree with it, in a sense, God is a very unpleasant idea. Just because if I believe in God, it means that I have to believe in a personal being which has authority over me. And now if I even cannot have good reasons or good evidence, 100% certain evidence that there is a God, then what is the reason, or how does it make sense to believe in such a being? But anyway, that might be one of the reasons that why religion in general is not so popular in a secularized context. So these existential conditions might be there behind why people are feeling or thinking that the secularization is always a detachment from faith. Well, I now, and lastly, my last point is I reconsider the concept of myth. What do we mean when we talk about myths? I have learned that talking about myths does not necessarily to take a stand towards the truthfulness or untruthfulness of a myth. So that a myth usually fulfills other functions as cognitive functions. And according to this kind of interpretation, a myth can be true or it can be untrue scientifically or historically. And I think that the truth of a myth is one thing. The reason why we need the myths is another thing. And in my opinion, these two ways of seeing a myth have they interrelate with each other. Well, I think that's all I have to say at the moment.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's really great to be here. I was a bit uncertain about what I was going to say here, and all of a sudden, after listening to these talks, I'm kind of sort of bursting with ideas. So I hope my 15 minutes will be sufficient. This is a really, really fantastic topic. Really, really sort of a delicious set of ideas that we can work with in the context of juxtaposing science and religion. There's a really cool book by this science fiction author called Alastair Reynolds, one of my favorite writers, called Century Reign. It's a book where basically the humankind discovers a wormhole and they enter it and they go to basically to the other side of the universe, and they discover that inside this sort of mini Dyson sphere there's another Earth. And this Earth has been stuck in the 1950s. So basically what happened was that Hitler failed the conquest of France, and then history took a different kind of turn. And the reason that's never found out in the book why Hitler had to fail this conquest was that if he had succeeded, we would have discovered the atom bomb, nuclear power, and so forth. And we would have had scientific instruments to figure out that we're living inside a mini Dyson sphere. But now these guys who lived on this double Earth didn't have those instruments. Hence, whenever they looked up at the starry sky, they saw stars just as we do, but they had no way of figuring out that the stars were fake. Oh, sounds pretty Cartesian, right? Now the problem with science is the fact that even though we do have the instruments to figure out that there is no Dyson sphere, circumferring in the Earth, we do not have sufficient instruments, for example, to figure out whether that mini Dyson sphere would actually be a gigantic Dyson sphere encapsulating the entire solar system. We don't have instruments like that. Everything that we use to figure out astronomy, for example, redshifts and so forth, is basically, it could just as well be that aliens are fooling us, they're pulling our legs. It could be the case. Now this brings us to the very limits of knowledge, which is, I think, the business of science to figure out. I mean, knowledge is the business of science to figure out. Limits of knowledge is the business of us philosophers to figure out. Interestingly enough, I think one of the most sort of useful shorthands for figuring out knowledge was already presented by the antique Greeks, by Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle, is this tripartite division of propositions to episteme, doxa, and pistis. So episteme is about these propositions that are true, justified beliefs. Doxastic beliefs are propositional attitudes towards the truth or falsity of certain propositions. And then there's this interesting little thing called pistis, or in English, I think in Finnish it's pretty weird that we don't have this distinction between belief and faith. But with faith, we're doing something completely different that we're doing with episteme and doxa. Now actually I made this diagram, but I don't know if I have the time to share this with you, but I might try. This is a bit because, like, when you mentioned this, like, sort of evidentialism versus fideism or Wittgensteinianism, I'm a kind of a banner-bearing Wittgensteinian philosopher. I actually even did my master's thesis in Wittgenstein. And I think this is a kind of a way to, if I may draw a little diagram here, if it's okay.
Just knock yourself out, as the Americans say.
Yeah, cool. So basically, I mean, this is a bit of I hope you'll bear with me, because it's been a while that I've had the chance to do any analytic philosophy. I'm kind of bursting with joy to be able to do this. So basically, you can draw this sort of set of all possible propositions. So this is everything that we can say from here to eternity. And now the problem is, I mean, the logical positivists, they felt that there are certain things that we might perhaps not be able to ever ascertain or verify. And the logical positivists, they felt that, okay, let's just ignore that stuff, because it's uncomfortable to think that we might have some propositions that we'll never, ever figure out. Well, I say, let's not throw them out. Let's introduce epistemic humility. Let's be a bit more humble. Let's accept that right now, as this sort of Cartesian cliche that I gave you in the beginning points out, there are lots and lots of things that we don't know, that we don't have an epistemic grasp on. That's a fact. But it may well be that there is no endpoint to this positivistic dream of the final science that ascertains the verity or averity of every single proposition imaginable. So some of these propositions may not ever be figured out. That's a possibility. To some people, if you want to have the final science, it's uncomfortable. If you introduce epistemic humility, it may be that we'll never find out what these propositions are. It's actually pretty cool. I'll explain in a minute why. Okay, so inside this circle, there's another group of propositions. And these are the doxastic propositions. So they are the propositions that we can hypothetically either verify or falsify. And now I would like to argue that it is the business of science to sort the true doxastic beliefs out of the false ones. And now we have this one last category, the epistemic category, which are the true justified beliefs. So these are the things that we believe to be true, and what we're really damn good at explaining why they are good. For example, that the world consists of atoms. I think that's a pretty good epistemic fact. I mean, it is granted, it could be that the world actually consists of little microscopic leprechauns that are playing ping pong. This is actually, it's a viable hypothesis. The problem is that there are no sufficient evidence to support this hypothesis. Whereas the idea that the world consists of microscopic oscillators has thousands, tens of thousands of research papers supporting it. So this goes into, I would like to argue it goes into the epistemic. We know for a fact that the world consists of atoms. Then we need to separate two kinds of doxastic propositions. The ones that we kind of entertain as true, and the ones that we entertain as false. Now, what's the difference here? I mean, the true justified beliefs go here. So what are these true beliefs? Well, there are, for example, things like there is alien life. What do you think about that? I'm gonna chuck it in there, in the D parenthesis T category. I just had a discussion with Esko Valtaja, who's like one of the most popular and prominent astronomers in Finland. And he told me, like, that there is a very good chance that we'll discover life either on Mars or Europa, a moon of Jupiter. So if Esko Valtaja tells me this, it's almost, I could justify by authority, right? But he didn't tell it to me as a fact. He told it to me as a viable hypothesis that he believes in. So we entertain this belief that there is, at least me and Esko Valtaja, that there is life elsewhere in the universe. We don't know it for a fact. We don't have evidence for it. We don't have sufficient justification for it to be epistemic. But it's a pretty damn good doxastic belief. What do you think? Or a doxastic proposition, aka a belief. Yeah. So what are the false doxastic propositions? Well, I might venture, for example, a proposition like, there is a spaghetti monster that governs the world. Now, what I'm saying is that it's the business of science to ascertain whether or not there are spaghetti monsters in the world. What do you think about this? Is this a viable attitude? If there is a spaghetti monster, we can put up a telescope, we can try to see if it's out there. If we see it there, we can make further measurements, we can publish a paper, we can discuss it academically, and eventually we'll find out that this doxastic proposition that we entertained as false was in fact true, might actually even be epistemic. It's a possibility, but it's not a very good possibility, and therefore, with this sort of small academic authority I have, I would love to put the spaghetti monster in here. But then there's the group of propositions that concern faith. And these propositions are uncomfortable for the positivists because they are averidical or non-veridical. They do not have truth value at all. This is the group of propositions that we may entertain, but we may never, ever, even hypothetically, be able to ascertain as true or false. And as one example of propositions that I would love to put into this category is this idea. I really need to look this up because it's a complicated proposition. That there is a God that is an active force affecting everything in the universe, and that is good. Now, how on earth would you even begin to create an experimental setting to verify this proposition? I have absolutely no idea. Now, mind you, if there is a God who has a huge beard and who lives on top of a cloud, that's the business of the scientists to figure out. I think they figured out that there is no such guy out there. I suppose, we could put it there. But if there's a God that somehow completely permeates, that's present, ever present in everything that we do, for the love of everything, I can't come up even with a supposition of an experimental setup that would be able to ascertain the truth of this proposition, or the falsity thereof. So now the last question is, what should we do with these difficult propositions? I'll say this and then I'll stop. Well, one option is, of course, let's just ignore them. That's what the logical positivists did. Mind you, I think quite a few of the logical positivists, for some reason, I think they're a bit gloomy bunch. The other possibility is that we see what happens if we commit to them. We just take them for granted. There is a God, God is good, it's a thorough permeating force in the entire universe. And surprisingly, what happens when people commit to these very fundamental religious truths, these pistis propositions, is that people tend to feel more at peace with the world. They tend to feel somehow more balanced. There's even research that points towards religious people being more happy than atheists. So we can't ascertain them, we can't prove them, we can't present them as metaphysical or ontological fact. But still, something changes in us as human beings if we commit to these certain propositions. And now as the final point, if that something is something that we together feel or ascertain as a good thing, then regardless of the fact that we need to be humble we need to be epistemically humble towards these propositions, I say we should commit to those kinds of non-vertical propositions that show to be good for us. Thank you very much.
John, would you like to respond to the... Yes. Yeah, you can take the stand here.
Well, can I just say I've been absolutely delighted to hear those responses. Of course, I could just say I agree with all of them, and that cuts short the discussion. But I have been struck by the distinctiveness of each of those contributions and how they've taken our discussion further. I thought that our first speaker, by differentiating so clearly three aspects of what we may call secularization, really did take the discussion further. I remember having a discussion with Ronald Numbers, who is the editor of this now famous book, this afternoon, on the question of the difference between privatization and secularization. Now, we've had privatization as another aspect of secularization. Ron, I think, the editor, takes the view that references to the secularization of religion or the secularization of society can be rather vague and ambiguous for some of the reasons we've been discussing this afternoon. But he has a very clear notion that when we speak of the privatization of religion, we are speaking of something which is really quite precise, that people should be free to hold in private whatever beliefs they may wish to do so. As soon as they impact on the public sphere, then we need to look at them much more closely. And in that context, I was very struck by the point you made about how we think of science as something publicly owned, but of religion perhaps that belongs primarily to the private sphere. And I was just trying to reflect on why we believe that so strongly. Well, of course, science through its technology does impact on all of us in far more ways than we recognize. You've only got to look around this room at so many bits of technology, for example, that affect our daily lives. Whereas it is not clear that religious beliefs in any generalizable way impinge on everybody's experience. And I think the question in my mind is, what is it that justifies the claim that scientific knowledge is universal knowledge and that religious knowledge or religious beliefs simply cannot claim that same kind of universality? So that, it seems to me, is a further question that we can take from the analysis we had, for which I'm extremely grateful. I was also very struck by the point you made that it is not easy, particularly when thinking about contemporary science, to come up with examples of where religious belief is somehow shaping the scientific inquiry or shaping the content of scientific theory or the kind of conclusions you might come to from scientific research. In fact, if there was a suspicion that religious beliefs were shaping the content of scientific claims, those claims, I think, would be regarded with enormous suspicion by the scientific community. It is part of the culture of modern science that you don't give religion even an inch when it comes to trying to infiltrate in some way scientific activity. So I agree with you, it is now very difficult to discern examples, even where the initiation of a piece of science may have been shaped or influenced in all kinds of subtle ways by the religious beliefs of the person who is interested or highly motivated to conduct that research. But I think as a historian, I should just be allowed to say that in a surprising number of ways, religious beliefs have infiltrated the conduct of science in the past, before perhaps modern scientific sensibilities have come to completely dominate the area of discourse we're discussing. I mean, here's an example from the 19th century. Michael Faraday, perhaps the greatest physical scientist in England in the pre-Darwinian period. Faraday's work on the interconvertibility of physical forces was sustained by the belief that the forces of nature are all ultimately one, and they belong to a unified creation, which is the product of one mind. In other words, the quest for the unity of nature, which somebody like Steve Weinberg sees as a secular kind of quest, that attempt to unify nature, very strong in Faraday, was very strong in Newton, perhaps even stronger in Einstein. It does have a theological grounding in the belief of some kind of unifying mind, which is somehow evident or present in the natural world. So that would be just one example. It's a subtle one, but I think there are many examples from history of where the science is actually affected by the religious beliefs. Fascinating example from the late 19th century, when after Darwin, the concept of evolution, of course, became popular really quite quickly. But the idea of natural selection as the mechanism for evolution remained highly controversial, even among life scientists, until arguably the neo-Darwinian synthesis, the modern synthesis in the 1930s. So the concept of natural selection is highly controversial. And yet in Oxford, my own university, at the end of the 19th century, there were scientists who were also Anglican Christians, deeply influenced by the theology of the liberation or liberal theologian Aubrey Moore, who believed, following Moore, that natural selection was perfectly compatible with Christian theology. They were two at least, scientists in Oxford who defended natural selection, both scientifically and theologically, when it was deeply controversial scientifically. So it would be an interesting example there of where a theology, and an explicit theology in Aubrey Moore, is providing grounds for the defense of natural selection, a concept that we sometimes think of as alien to the science of the period. So I think if you look hard enough, you can find very interesting examples from the past. But I basically agree with you. It is very difficult now because it is part of the culture simply to prohibit any kind of incursion of that kind, however promising it might appear to be. Our second speaker gave us the question, why are the myths important nowadays? For historians, that's a fascinating question, because two books were published at the end of the 19th century, which famously articulated the concept of conflict or warfare between science and religion. I mentioned one in my talk, John William Draper's The Conflict Between Religion and Science. The other was a book written by the first president of Cornell University, Andrew Dixon White, who wanted to advance the cause of secular and scientific education and faced the ostracization of the clerical authorities in the region of that university when it was founded. Now, the reason this is interesting is that White wrote a book called A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom, where he tried to get his revenge on the clerics who were attacking his proposals for educational reform and for Cornell to be a thoroughly secular university. And his book is full of very entertaining examples of how stupid clergymen opposed the latest enlightened science. To give you one example from his book, he mentions the way in which, to ward off thunderstorms in churches right across Europe, it was common practice to ring the church bells. Now, of course, this isn't a terribly effective way of warding off a storm. And White rejoices in telling the story of how few churches fitted lightning conductors, even after Benjamin Franklin had shown that lightning was a big electrical blast. And he literally documents the number of bell ringers across Europe who continued to be killed in thunderstorms because the church had not fitted a lightning conductor. And it's just a spectacular example of how the clergy, as defenders of the faith, are portrayed as idiotic and stupid, even causing the deaths of many people, whereas the scientists are the enlightened ones. Now, here is the question. When a book of that kind is written and sells many, many copies, when it's full of examples which you can actually show historically are false or are misleading or are highly contrived to justify the thesis, why is it that those two books, written more than 100 years ago, which are full of errors, and any historian would just simply say, don't bother to read them. Why are they still in print? Why are they still selling? Why is it that conferences often begin with Draper and White? Why are they still authorities? It's because their mythology of conflict and warfare is serving some kind of purpose. People want there to be a conflict between science and religion. And so, yes, the really interesting question is, why do people want there to be a conflict between science and religion? And I think this takes me back to the point that the reason they want conflict is that they don't like religion for various reasons. And some of them I happened to mention in the talk, and we had other references too. I'd just like to say on the question of myth, I remember having another discussion with Ronald Numbers, and I said to him, when theologians talk about myth, they talk about a concept that is more sophisticated than simply meaning an untruth or a falsehood. But Ron, as the editor, insisted that he was going to use the word myth in the very simple common sense view of something that is false. But I think we should have had a discussion in that book about alternative meanings of myth and how they do actually function, both in religion, but also in science, because each science has its foundation myth. And I made a very brief reference to the Huxley-Wilberforce debate, if you remember, right at the beginning of my lecture. And the reason why Huxley is so often presented as the victor, the winner in that debate, the reason is that that constitutes a foundation myth for scientific professionalism. Huxley has to be the winner because he is the one who is fighting the authority of an obscurantist church. Now, we could say a lot more about that example, but it's an interesting way in which professional science has its foundation myths, just like different world religions have their foundation myths. And it's a very interesting concept to follow through. On the third talk, which I found extremely interesting and again opening up a huge area of discussion, I'm just going to stick with the aliens, if I might, for a moment, because I'm very fond of the aliens. And it is a topic that has interested me greatly as a historian of science, because the idea of extraterrestrial life is not an ultra-modern or even a modern or even a 17th century idea. This takes us all the way back to the Greeks, to the atomists of antiquity, who believed there was an infinite multiplicity of worlds, not just other worlds, but an infinite number of worlds. And that was part of classical atomistic philosophy that you find in Leucippus, Democritus, Epicurus, and in Lucretius, whom I mentioned. Now, the point I simply want to make here, and it takes me back to my first comment, when you look at the history of the concept of extraterrestrial life, you can find that religious ideas and scientific ideas are contributing almost on an equal basis into discussions of the plausibility or the impossibility of there being life on other worlds. For example, on the theological side, there were objections, not least because Jesus Christ has come as the incarnate Son of God to the earth. If there's life on other worlds, are there multiple incarnations, multiple resurrections? That kind of argument which Tom Paine developed. But then equally, theologically, you could argue, as Giordano Bruno did, that an infinite plurality of worlds would be a perfect expression of God's infinite power. So the theological arguments pull both ways, depending on how you wish to emphasize one doctrine rather than another. But it's also true scientifically. The arguments pull both ways. The Copernican innovation presents the Earth as a planet like other planets, so by analogy, there might be life on other worlds. So the Copernican innovation raises the profile, one might say, of extraterrestrials. But then you can ask the question, well, what kind of conditions are there on these other worlds? And whatever the physicists and the chemists might say about identical or similar conditions to those obtaining on Earth, there is still this problem that the way life has evolved on Earth, if the neo-Darwinians are correct, is that it has been a very chancy process. Each step depending on a chancy step that has preceded it. Therefore, you could have identical conditions to those on Earth, on an exoplanet at exactly the same distance from its sun as we are from ours. You could have all the physico-chemical conditions that might produce life and still not get it, because the Darwinian theory does not make life inevitable just when the physico-conditions might be correct. Well, I won't go rabbiting on, but that does make the subject of extraterrestrial life particularly interesting, and it makes it a very good topic for the thesis you were arguing. So, thank you for that.